welcome everyone to the next IUC webinar. We are going to talk about gender equal cities today. I hope you can all hear me and that you will be able to hear our guests soon. Let me start maybe first with a few technical announcements so that we are sure that everything is working okay on this end. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I hope most of you have figured this out already, but if not, please go to the communicate menu part and choose audio connections and make sure that you're using computer audio so that you can hear us. And I hope it will be working for all of you. And if not, please write in the chat and perhaps we will be able to help you. But if not, don't worry, you can also listen to the recording afterwards. And the next slide. And talking about interaction, I know that it feels a little strange sometimes with this kind of online meetings, and as climate friendly as they are, it can feel a little lonely sitting in front of your screen. So we really want to have you interact with us, and even though our presentations will be pre-recorded, our panelists are here live with us and will be answering your questions. And in order to ask them, you should use the Q&A panel that you can find in the right corner of your screen. And if you just open it, you can type your question and send it. And I think it's best if you send it to all panelists so that we can see it and then choose the best person to answer your question. Hope this is working for you. And I think now we can move to the content part of the webinar. So my name is Anja Rock. I am an IUC expert and I will be moderating this session today. I'm really excited that we are talking about gender equal cities because it's a topic that is gaining a lot of attention. I think it's making some people uncomfortable. It's making some people curious. It's making many people hopeful also, both men and women, all over Europe and also the world. And what I wanted to say is that I'm really happy that we have this fantastic lineup of speakers today. And they have a lot of examples to show you from their cities and from other cities they have been working with. But one thing that is very clear is that we don't have all the answers yet, that this is a topic, a theme that is growing very quickly, that is developing very quickly, and that we are also all together figuring out as we go. So please feel free to ask any question you want. Please feel free to also share examples from your cities, because this is a very urgent topic, but something that we need to learn all together how to best make sure that our cities are the best possible places to live. And maybe not wanting to take too much time, I would now before I do that, I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of what we are going to have in stock today. So we will start with the short overview of the IUC program that is organizing this webinar. Then we will have a kind of scene-setting presentation about gender equal cities from URBACT expert Sally Nisho. She will be talking about the great report that URBACT has produced. And then we will move to stories from the ground. Unfortunately, the city of Rosario from Argentina was not able to join us this time, but we have two fantastic IUC cities, Umea from Sweden and Fredericton from Canada. So you will hear about their projects. You will have a chance to ask some quick questions, but then we have saved half an hour at the end for a more in-depth discussion with all three panelists. So I hope you stay with us until the end. And now I will hand over to Sylvia to give you a quick intro to what IUC is all about.
Thank you so much, Anja, for giving me the floor and for taking us through the agenda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. Many of you may already know what the IUC program is about, since this is the 7th episode of this webinar series, but I guess it's still worth to spend a couple of minutes to introduce the program for whom of you that might not know what we are talking about. So I'm Silvia Cellini and I'm part of the coordination unit of this IUC program. In the next slide, you can see stands for International Urban Cooperation. It's founded by the European Union and aims to enable cities in different parts of the world to link up and share solutions on common problems that they are facing. As part of the long-term strategy, it's supposed to it supports the sustainable urban development with involvement on different stakeholders, so not only the public sector but also the private, as well as research and of course civil society. In next slide, you can see one of our main framework of reference, the Sustainable Development Goals that we are trying to implement at local level and in all the countries that we are working in, not only from an environmental point of view, not only on an economical point of view, and not only from a social point of view, but what we try to do is to have an holistic approach to tackle and take into consideration those three elements at once. On the other hand side, and on the same line in the next slide, you can see more European reference in the our framework of reference, which is the 12 priority themes of the European Urban Agenda. Starting from this point, next slide will show you all the topics that we are actually and currently work on. We cluster them in these 7 themes, but of course they are way more flexible and cross-cutting. In next slide, you will see the 3 components that IUC is made of. So let's say 3 kind of stream of work. We have component 1, which is about city-to-city cooperation, and component 2 that sustain the Global Covenant of Mayenne, and the component 3, which is the interregional cooperation. So next slide will show you a bit of numbers. So for what regard component 1, city-to-city cooperation, what we do is to pair an European city with another city around the world. The region that we are currently working with are North America, South America, India, China, and Japan. And based on the common challenges that they are facing, they establish a cooperation for a minimum 18 months, which will lead them to draft a local action plan. On the next slide, you will see, it's a reference to the component 2, so supporting the Global Covenant of Mayenne that work in adaptation and mitigation. From who of you that don't know, that are not familiar with this, the Global Covenant of Mayenne is a movement of cities that commit to become ambitious. And then on the next slide, you will have a better grasp of what component 3 is about. So next slide, please. That is the regional cooperation. So basically, same as component 1, but we do not work on urban and city level, but we look at this is component 2, yes, and this is component 3, linking up European regions with regions from Latin America. So this is, in a nutshell, what the IUC program is about. And last slide, we show you some contacts and useful sources. You can, of course, learn more from our website, which is www.iuc.eu. Very important is that on the website you will have free access also to our research page, where you can see our case studies that will show you more in depth what cooperation, city-to-city cooperation is about, and you will also find the link to this video when will be available roughly from 2 weeks from now. So among the people the kind of participants that Anya was mentioning, I'm definitely among the curious and the hopeful. So I want really to learn more about the topic. Looking forward to what's coming next. And back to you, Anya, the floor.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. And curious and hopeful is definitely what we welcome very much here. And I'm also really happy to report that we have over 60 people with us online at the moment. And I have to say, it's obviously a bit hard to guess just looking at your logins, but I would say it's a pretty strong female majority for now, but also very warm welcome to our male participants. Thank you for joining us. I think it's really important that talking about gender equality is not just a women's issue, but that's something that we all address together. So I would like to then move to the setting the scene presentation about gender equal cities. Can we start the presentation from Sally?
Hello, my name is Sally Neeshaw, and I'm a programme expert with URBACT, leading on the Gender Equal Cities initiative. Thanks to the International Urban Cooperation Programme for hosting this webinar today, and thanks to all of you for connecting. I hope that you'll find the presentations and examples inspiring, and that you'll join us in an ongoing dialogue about what we can all do to combat gender-based inequalities. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to explain a bit about the URBACT Gender Equal Cities initiative and highlight some of the findings from the report that we launched earlier this year. I'm really pleased that Linda Gustafsson of the city of Umeå is with us. Umeå has been very active in URBACT gender work to date and is now leading a new learning network on the topic. I'm also looking forward to hearing more about the IUC Gender Project between Fredericton and Parma. And at the end of this presentation, I'll share some links for those wanting to download the reports we mention and join our urban knowledge platforms. For those who are not familiar with URBACT, it is a European territorial cooperation programme that supports exchange and learning between cities. Our primary activity is co-financing and supporting learning networks that enable cities to be more innovative, more sustainable, and to work in integrated and participatory ways. We also build capacity and produce new knowledge for urban policymakers, as in the case of this initiative on gender equality. We've seen that exchanging and documenting knowledge in this way is one of the best ways to improve our impact. URBACT networks address a whole range of urban challenges, for example, on climate change, social integration, housing, mobility, planning, and much more. Each participating city produces an action plan using what we call the URBACT method. That involves an integrated approach to solving complex urban issues, a participative approach involving all local stakeholders, and transnational exchange, building on the learning within the network. So why did URBACT start an initiative on gender equal cities? First of all, in spite of the great progress we've made, we see that inequality is persistent. As you can see from these graphics, in terms of representation, the pay gap, design and use of public services and space, there's still a lot to do. We need to do more and better, and to accelerate change. Cities are the level of government closest to citizens, and their space, design and services have an impact on everyday lives. International and national initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals and national frameworks are important, but we wanted to develop a better understanding of the urban dimensions of gender-based inequality and to shine a light on the potential for local level action. Our message is also that gender equality is everyone's responsibility and for everyone's benefit. The lessons in our report are targeted at city administrations, but are equally relevant for citizens, for NGOs, and for academics to help us all push for change and to hold local administrations to account. To start the initiative, URBACT called out to cities, participated in conferences and exchanges, and tried to find out what cities across Europe are doing and what more they could do. The results in the report, as you can see on the screen, are structured across themes that mirror city departments and show the wide range of actions that need to be coordinated in order to make more equal cities. Gender equality is a cross-cutting issue, and there's always a danger that cross-cutting issues can be neglected or can become box-ticking exercises or just sometimes seem too overwhelming to tackle. These actions need to be rooted in departments across local government, and we've seen from our work that in successful cities like Umeå and Vienna, this kind of mainstreamed approach, when delivered consistently over time, really brings rewards. The Gender Equal Cities initiative has been enriched by a partnership with the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, and in particular, the work following on from their Charter on Equality of Women and Men in Local Life. This is a useful political tool that signals commitment to equality, and we include a link to it and its observatory at the end of this presentation. Our report includes cases and examples from cities who've signed that charter, from cities involved in URBACT exchange and beyond, and with testimonies and experience from experts and gender officers across Europe, who you'll see in the coming slides. The report aims to be accessible and actionable, and above all, to convince urban professionals to become more gender sensitive. I'll now give some brief examples from some of the chapters in the report. Local democracy is guaranteed both through formal and informal representation, participation, and processes that require sensitivity to gender. Gender equal cities constantly ask themselves about who is empowered to contribute to decision making, which voices are not being heard, how can representation and knowledge gaps be filled. In the report, we give examples of initiatives to support women running for office, being sustained once they are in office, and getting into the portfolios that are traditionally held by men. There are also case studies on reaching out to women and girls to seek their views and opinions about the city to create a city for everyone. In the chapter on economic equality, we present data and examples about women's participation in the labour market and access to economic resources. There are initiatives to reduce labour market segregation by, for instance, working in schools to reduce gender stereotypes that affect academic and career choices early on. We feature campaigns that train women in business support and networking with the view to close the entrepreneurship gap. There's also a case of a technology-based platform that fosters gender-equal care sharing networks. The report proposes rethinking current practices to make the labour market fairer and safer, allowing both men and women to enjoy fulfilling lives with space for professional and personal development. In the chapter on planning and public space, we highlight examples from cities that have focused on the physical structure of the city to improve the quality of everyday life for all. We report on the long experience of the city of Vienna in gender mainstreaming on parks, public space, and housing projects. In this slide, you see some images from Vienna of their report on gender mainstreaming, of a new neighbourhood where the streets are named after women, of icons on public transport that don't conform to gender norms, and of a treehouse in a park designed in consultation with young women who had said that they'd like to see and not be seen. This example from Trappes in France shows how play environments can be redesigned to deconstruct gender stereotypes. The town has redeveloped school playgrounds with neutral colours, toys, and multiple worlds, as opposed to one central area. There are spaces for creativity, drama, and engaging with nature, as well as sports and active games, that allow children to choose the way they play without conforming to the pressure of stereotypes. The final chapter on migrant integration gives examples from Berlin and Athens how to work with the specific and additional challenges faced by migrant girls and women, including recovering from trauma, language and literacy skills development, increased risk of exclusion, experiences of racism, sometimes related to racial and religious identities. The image is of a project in Neukölln, Berlin, called Stadtteilmutter, District Mothers. It gives training to migrant women on 10 topics related to the city, from education to health, and they then share that knowledge in their native languages with their own community. The report findings have stressed a number of principles for gender equality in cities. The integrated and participatory approaches, which are the cornerstone of URBACT networks and methods, are also the best way to connect gender equality to all policy and involve women and girls of all backgrounds in decisions about the city. Additionally, intersectionality is key. That means us not only thinking about gender, but all the other dimensions of power and exclusion. Some individuals and groups do not have an equal share in the city, so taking into account the experiences and needs of women of colour, of different ages, of different socioeconomic profiles, LGBTQI and disabled women is paramount. Involving civil society and NGOs is another key principle. In all EU cities, there are groups representing different voices, and in most cases, knowledge institutions that can contribute a good deal to fill the knowledge gaps. They are key partners in developing gender equal cities. Integrating hard and soft measures is also important. For instance, with cohesion policy, making sure that we connect infrastructure development through the Regional Development Fund with things like skills development, leadership, training and animation through the European Social Fund. And finally, we need to continue to communicate that gender equality benefits everyone. I conclude with the graphic of 10 actions to kickstart gender equal cities. Achieving gender equality requires time, resources, expertise and culture change, and most crucially, an initial lens through which cities are viewed. We hope that these actions, the examples and cases, will help cities to find ways to improve across these areas. Finally, here are the links to some of the resources I've talked about in the presentation. The URBACT Knowledge Hub with the report on gender equal cities and animations is at urbact.eu. The Council of European Municipalities and Regions Charter and Observatory is at charter-equality.eu. We have a group on LinkedIn called Gender Equal Cities, and URBACT Twitter account is at URBACT. We also have a Facebook page. Please sign up to follow us, to follow our progress also on the new learning network on gender equality. We'd love for you to share your own news, examples, experiences and reports through the LinkedIn group, to create a network of gender champions and to keep this conversation going. Thanks so much for listening.
Yes, and a big thank you also from my side. We have Sally live here with us. So I don't know if you have any questions to her. Could you are welcome to put them in the Q&A section, and I will relate them to her. And maybe Sally, I give you the voice briefly in the meantime. If there is something that you would like to maybe tell the most important message of the Gender Equal Cities report for those that were not able to hear all of this. What was, from your perspective, the most important message?
Thanks, Anya, and I'm really sorry if you weren't able to hear, especially the beginning. For me, it got a little bit better as it went along, but some of the beginning maybe you missed, and so I hope people will come back to that presentation when it goes onto the IUC website. I think what maybe we missed at the beginning is the reason why we decided to do some work on gender equal cities. And the two main reasons that maybe you missed at the beginning are first of all, we have made a lot of progress, but the progress is too slow. And the slide showed some of the data around the gender pay gap, how long it's taking to close that gap, and also about representation of women, political representation. So we think that there's good data that we need to pay attention to and to help us to move forward faster on gender equality. And I think the second reason is that a lot of people will look at international and national frameworks like the SDGs, which are of course really important, but cities can do a lot. And so we wanted to look at the potential for local level action and to be really practical and actionable and show cities what can be done, what's going on in other cities across all of the competences in the city, and to think about how we connect gender to lots of different policy areas within the city and to grow our awareness of what the impact is on men and women at local level from different parts of the city. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm really happy to be here and part of this and to be sharing this knowledge and listening also to other cities and to hear about their experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think if you still need more time to think about your questions, that's fine. We can go back to Sally later. I think what is really important, and that's why I'm also really happy that we're having this discussion, even with all the problems, is that I think there is a lot of talk about gender equality, but sometimes we forget about things that are within the mandate of local government, as Sally said, and we expect maybe individual action or action on national or above levels, but we forget about the local scale as something very important. And I think it's local scale, meaning both what happens in the city, but also about local government's own responsibility, also as an employer, for instance. And I think now, I have to say, with a slightly trembling heart, I would like to move to the presentation from our guests from Canada, Michelle Cronin and Nina McCarthy from Fredericton, that will talk about the responsibility of local government as an employer and also about their cooperation with the city of Parma within the IUC pairing. We thought about maybe trying the live version now.
Thank you for asking the City of Fredericton to participate in this webinar. I am Michelle Cronin, Research and Planning Specialist from the Office of the Chief Administrative Officer.
Hello, and I'm Nina McCarthy, Deputy Fire Chief with the City of Fredericton. Just a little background about us. Fredericton is the capital city of New Brunswick, and we're located on the east coast of Canada. Our municipality serves a population of approximately 56,000 with up to 75,000 in the day. We're mostly a government and university town.
Next slide, please. The proposed project was to examine gender equity in leadership roles in municipal government with legislative equality as a variable. The goal of the study was to develop and test tools and methodologies to examine the impact of assumed barriers to female participation in local government leadership positions. Fundamental to the success of the project was the development of tools and methodologies that could be used in future studies to examine various interventions and various underrepresented groups.
What really spurred our interest, or perhaps piqued our curiosity, was the difference in legislation on gender equity between our two municipalities, and if the legislation had any effect on the progression of a woman or women in their careers. You see, Parma has a legislated requirement for a percentage of their leadership team to be made up of women, and we do not.
Next. The City of Fredericton has approximately 648 employees, with a ratio of 76% and 24% male employees to female employees. Parma has an opposite ratio to Fredericton, with 71% female employees to 29% male employees.
It's important to note that the differences in the ratios can partially be explained by the different types of services delivered to our citizens. Parma provides social services and an education component, which is primarily female, and while Fredericton provides roads and streets, water and sewer, fire services, which are predominantly male-dominated.
Next. Parma partnered with the University of Parma's Psychology Department to design and complete their focus group with employees. We partnered with an anthropologist at a local liberal arts university. Both teams conducted focus groups and a corporate-wide survey. Parma created their survey with the results and findings from their focus group sessions. We built our survey using the main themes from the Parma survey. Our team also added 2 additional methods, interviews and ethnographic research.
So our approach differed slightly in that we conducted research, and through the literature, we were able to determine that there are several common barriers that women typically face in the work environment. The barriers were most often associated to the corporate or private sector. However, we went forward with the most predominant barriers as those we were going to test within our municipality. I'm going to take a few minutes to touch on those.
Next.
So here we have our 6 assumed barriers we were going to test. The first being second-generation bias. These are subtle, often invisible barriers that arise from cultural assumptions and organizational structures, practices, and patterns of interaction that inadvertently benefit men while putting women at a disadvantage. Attribute bias, where we see women as less competent than men. We tend to give them less credit for accomplishments, and we often blame them for their mistakes. Lack of access to mentors, sponsors, and networks. This is where we have a lack of people to promote women's skills throughout the organization, their abilities, and we have fewer role models at the higher levels to look up to. Women don't see themselves in those senior positions, and as a result may not aspire to those roles. Double binds is where gender stereotypes and gender communication differences can pose dilemmas for women. The traditional perceptions of leadership are often associated with predominantly male qualities. The traits are decisive, assertive, independent, and women are sometimes expected to be caretaking, nice, unselfish, communal. Women are put in that position of being capable or liked, but not both. Maternal bias, and this is where women often experience career interruptions due to having children or taking time off to raise a family. Motherhood can also trigger false assumptions that women are now somehow less committed to their careers. Family can create barriers as there are often cultural expectations that women are or perhaps should be the primary caregivers. And affinity bias. And this is where we gravitate towards people like ourselves in appearance, beliefs, and background. With most of our senior positions being held by men, the promotion of women can be stagnated by this effect. This perpetuates the old boys club by creating a lack of opportunity for women at the top.
Next. Our team used 4 methodologies to test the existence of the gender barriers within our corporation. First, we completed several hour to an hour-and-a-half interviews to assist the team in testing the assumed gender barriers. Based on Parma's survey themes, we created a corporate-wide online survey. The themes in the survey were job satisfaction, career advancement, and understanding gender equity barriers. This created a baseline understanding for the project. We had a 33% response rate with an equal distribution of male and female respondents. The third methodology used was focus groups. We hosted 3 focus group sessions with approximately 8 to 10 employees. Each session was facilitated by the project lead and the university professor. The participants completed 3 exercises: social network mapping, your career timeline, and leadership attributes. The sessions concluded with a discussion surrounding participants' perceptions of barriers within our organization. The final and most unique data collection tool was ethnographic research designed by Associate Professor Toner from St. Thomas University. The team used participant observations with a goal of understanding work life as it is actually experienced in an attempt to yield insights that the interviews, focus groups, and other methods might have missed. To overcome some of the obstacles, such as the short time frame, we used an internal employee trained by the associate professor in this technique. Next. In total, approximately 266 encounters occurred where our employees were given an opportunity to participate in providing data. The data from all 4 methodologies were coded using a coding matrix containing 50 categories.
The results showed us that some of the assumed barriers do in fact exist. But I think what was interesting was that City of Fredericton employees did not feel that having children had had any effect on their careers.
Next. The aim of the project was to determine if the assumed barriers exist in the Municipal Corporation of Fredericton through a series of design methodologies and tools. In this context, the project was a success. Each tool and methodology provided data to support or disprove the assumed barriers. Nina will review these in the conclusion. The tools and methodologies were designed to be shared and can be used by other municipalities. The team determined that some tweaking of the tools and methodologies would be required in the future, such as these tweaks could include the consideration of locking their survey questions, requiring respondents to answer all of the questions in the survey, to extending the ethnographic research participant observation from the 2 days which we used to 5 days. There is also the potential to use the tools and methodologies to identify barriers to other underrepresented groups. Next.
Slide, please. Thank you. So in conclusion, there were similarities between the municipalities in the identified barriers, particularly the affinity bias and double binds. There were also differences, such as the maternal bias and second-generation bias. We feel the tools and methodologies in each city were a success, as they were able to identify and clarify barriers to women in each organization. And the final conclusion is that as a result of the IUC project, it was identified that barriers exist in both municipalities and that there is a need to make changes to policies and practices, ensuring a gender lens is applied to future work. And we thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. If you have any questions to Fredericton, please feel free to put them in the chat. If we don't manage now, we can come back to them in the final part of the webinar. I was personally, it's really fascinating to see how different the gender makeup of two municipalities is, depending on the types of tasks that you're responsible for. And I also found it interesting when you wrote in the last slide that you have confirmed that these barriers exist and you were able to describe them better using the tools. But I was wondering, what are the next steps? Do you have some ideas of how to address those barriers? Some kind of policy changes planned?
Yeah, so as a going forward, we've presented our findings to our senior management team within the municipality of Fredericton. And we plan to use the data that we've collected to create a working group going into 2020 to begin to actually apply that gender lens to some of our general practices within our organization.
Further to that, I think where the starting point is the fact that we're paying attention to this. At the senior leadership team, this is a regular dialogue, and it's something that hadn't happened in the past. It wasn't something that was paid attention to and acknowledged. And now, particularly our senior leadership team, so those would be directors and assistant directors, are now learning the language of what gender barriers are and gender differences and gender equity. So they're starting to speak that language, which I think, really helps with that shift. It's planting those seeds. Further to that, as part of that acknowledgement, Michelle has been key in developing and has now gone through the pilot group and into the second round of actual leadership programs within the municipality for women. So recognizing those women throughout the organization, throughout the corporation who have an interest in developing skills and who contribute already, but perhaps because of a lack of mentors or perhaps because of some of those other barriers we identified, haven't been given that boost. So it's an actual program to assist them with those leadership skills that we'd like to see in all of our employees.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's really important what you said, that sometimes we have maybe high expectations, thinking of the policies we can do to fix things, but actually in most municipalities, I would say right now, what you described is already a very big progress, that this becomes a topic and that people feel comfortable talking about this. They recognize it as a problem, and the data that you have collected are also providing useful evidence. So it's not just someone's impression, but something that has actually been researched. We have another question Is gender mainstreaming Is gender mainstreaming anchored in the administration? I can't now access it. In gender mainstreaming institutionally anchored in the municipal administration? For example, do you have gender representatives or women's advisory boards? This was question to both cities, but maybe we can hear first from Fredericton.
I wouldn't say that it's formalized as such. We don't have a particular group looking at that specifically, but I think Michelle alluded to that at the start when she began to answer the question. The previous question was the fact that in the new year that there will be in fact a group put together, and I'll let Michelle speak about that, a group put together that will actually be focused on that. And Michelle?
Yeah, so we in Fredericton, we know, and as research shows, that you need both participants from male and female in order to make it happen. We listened to what Sally Armstrong stated, and she said, why do people include men? And that's because we won't get across the finish line without their involvement and their support. So as we go into 2020, we're going to look at the results we found, as well as some of the ideas that our employees suggested, and actually turn that into an implementation plan over the next 2 or 3 years for our corporation.
And the other part to that is, although this isn't formalized, and perhaps we didn't express this clearly, is the fact that our CAO, so our Chief Administrative Officer, has made this a priority for his office. So the fact that at the very top of the organization, he hasn't said there has to be X numbers, or he hasn't said this is, he hasn't put quotas or anything of the sort. He said, let's make this a part of our everyday, and he's taking steps to make sure that we do that.
Great. Thank you very much for this answer. And I can, if we were all sitting in one room, I'm sure I could hear the sound of, people being jealous of something like that, because it's really, I think, quite unusual in most municipalities I know to hear this kind of commitment on the higher level. And I guess it also makes me think that we would probably need another webinar in a year to see how much did you manage to achieve, and how this commitment has changed the way things are working in your municipality. But I think before we go into a deeper discussion, I would like to also bring in a voice from Umeå, another IUC city that has been working on these topics for many years, has a lot of successes, but is also constantly developing their approach and trying out new things. And I'm very excited to have with us Linda Gustafsson, who will explain how this type of activity started in Umeå and where is Umeå right now. And I guess we're trying with the live version again, right? So Linda, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm really happy to be able to participate in this webinar, and I hope that everyone can hear me okay now that we're doing this live version. Umeå, just shortly about Umeå, it's a city with about 130,000 inhabitants, 35,000 students, and among cities in Sweden, it has the highest, just for an example, it has the highest level of outtake on parental leave among fathers. So the parental leave in Umeå, about 35% of it is taken out by fathers. Just shortly, also we have IUC cooperation with the city of Kamakura in Japan, and one of the topics that we are working with together with them is about gender equality. Next slide, please. Umeå has quite a long history. Umeå, located in the northern part of Sweden, has quite a long history of working with gender equality. There has been a gender equality committee with politicians from the city council responsible, or with a specific responsibility for gender equality that has been in place since 1994. But the first gender equality committee in Umeå, which was a little bit less formalized, was initiated in 1972. And someone like me, I work as a gender equality officer for the city of Umeå. Someone like me, a civil servant, that has been in place since 1989. And there is, Umeå has two overall goals, or overarching goals, for the city administration. and one of them is to create conditions for women and men to have equal power to shape society and their own lives. The goal when it comes to gender equality in Umeå is not a representational goal. It's not about having an equal share of women and men in every position or steering group or project group. It's about creating conditions for women and men to have equal power, both when it comes to their personal lives and when it comes to participating in society. Next slide, please. And this is how we try to do it. We try to work with a holistic way of looking at gender equality, and this has to do with this specific slide is about public space and how we try to create an understanding amongst both civil servants working in the municipality, but also with the organizations that we cooperate with, and among politicians, but also among inhabitants, that we need to have an understanding that when it comes to, for example, public space, women and men feel differently and use public space in different ways, and that has a number of reasons. But then also remembering that women and men are not homogeneous groups. There's a lot of differences within those groups, of course, to try to have an intersectional approach also to work with gender equality. And we think that having the approach of looking at an equal share of power, we believe that that is a good way of doing that. But women and men they transport themselves in different ways. They spend their free time a little bit in different ways, different expectations, gender segregated labor market, and so on and so on. That affects how we feel and use or feel and how we use public space. So we think that it's important to create the understanding that create an understanding of the lives of the inhabitants of the city from a gender equality perspective. So this is a survey that we do in Umeå. This is a travel habit survey that we do. So this is just to also give an example of what happens when you also gender segregate all your data. This is something that we do every 4 years in Umeå to monitor the sustainable travel. And this was the last survey that we did in 2016. And it shows that 56% of women's travel is sustainable, meaning it's done by taking the bus, riding your bike, or walking. And 42% of men's travel. And in 2016, when this survey was made, we had the goal for the city of Umeå that 55% of all travel should be sustainable. So then we could see that if men traveled like women, we would have reached our sustainability goals. And that also means that we can see that there are certain groups that we need to maybe address more when it comes to increasing sustainable travel, men as a group, but also we did the math and looked at the carbon monoxide emissions, and we could, because Umeå is electrifying the bus fleet, and that also led to the discussion, we can see that we would lower the carbon monoxide emissions more if we could get men to travel by bus and in comparison to electrifying the bus fleet. So that's also a way of looking at or using gender equality to problematize the different solutions that we talk about when it comes to sustainability. Next slide, please. This is another survey that is done in Umeå. This is the first. Umeå is the first city in Sweden that has done a local consumer habit survey to look at how and what the inhabitants consume and buy and how they do that. So this is just one graph from that, and the orange is women and the blue is men. So this was a question about who plans the grocery shopping, and as you can see, 70% of women have answered that they plan the grocery shopping in comparison to a little bit over 30% of men. You could also see, which I think is very interesting, that men have stated that it's an equal share to a higher extent than women have stated that. But this also, of course, is important to look at and understand, not only when it comes to urban planning, but how do we plan our neighborhoods? Where are the grocery stores? Is it possible to travel sustainable to the grocery stores? But also, this is of course important when it comes to labor markets. The city of Umeå is a big employer. A lot of women work in the city of Umeå, and to look at the balance between professional and their work-life balance. So we also consumer habit survey, so the question of who plans the grocery shopping, to see that could give really important information also when it comes to, for example, urban planning. Next slide. This is a slide that I use. It's very not high-tech, but it's a slide that I try to use to, and it should be animated, but it's not. It all came at once, but this is a slide that I use to try to highlight that we need to understand, once again, just we need to try to understand the living conditions of women and men in the city, to understand that we live in different types of housing. We travel by bike, but we travel by bike together. We have our children with us when we ride our bikes. We go past the preschool before we go to work. Not everyone works in an office. A lot of people, especially women, work in care or they work at preschools. That means that they work in different neighborhoods, not in the city center or the campus area, and that after work we need to go to the grocery store, and that there's a difference when it comes to feeling of safety and security, if it's late at night or if it's light or if it's dark, if it's winter or it's summer. So it's just something that I use when I educate within the city administration and politicians and other organizations on really the importance of understanding the living conditions. So next slide. Yeah, so that we don't plan for an understanding that this is how people live their lives. Next slide. But that this is how people live their lives. And if we don't create that understanding, then that would probably mean, in the context of Umeå, that instead of people traveling, for example, sustainable, they will take their car. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you some concrete examples of projects, especially from the built environment, and how we have integrated gender equality. So we can take the next slide. This is a project in the city center of Umeå, very close to the river that goes through the city center of Umeå. And here we worked with something that we call inclusion through exclusion, meaning that we can see that young people are not participating to a very high extent in citizen dialogue, and especially young women. So we chose to only have dialogue with young women when it came to this specific place in this public park. And you can see a piece of that public park up in the right corner. This is what it looks, the space looked like before or when we started the project. And we had, as we very often have, involvement from the University of Umeå with researchers from different parts of the university. And we also worked, as you can see, there's a picture also of some of the young women that participated. We had workshops. We tried to have creative workshops. So we had dance and theater, and we had photography, and it ended up being a discussion about expectations. Being a young woman in Umeå, what are the expectations being a young woman in Umeå? Do you feel like you have the right to, do you feel like you're a part of the public space? Do you feel like you have a right to be there? Do you feel, of course, we talked about safety and secure feelings of security, but more about what it's like. So if you can take the next slide. This is what it looks like now in the summertime, because what the girls showed us through the different workshops and talked about was that they wanted somewhere where they could hang out together with their friends or alone, where there was no expectations of them to do anything specific, because in Sweden at least, it's very common that when we create public spaces that are aimed at young people, we tend to create public spaces that encourage physical activity. So we do skateboarding parks and football fields and basketball courts to try to encourage physical activity. But what these young women told us very clearly was that they wanted somewhere where they can hang out and where they had the right to be. This is not a space for only young women, of course. It's a public park, but they were the ones who were involved in creating the space. And we also tried to use norm-critical design. So you can see on the photograph that these young women, the back of the swings are made for someone who's about their height. So it's not made for a very tall man. Next slide. And this is what it looks like in the winter time. Next slide. This is a part of a city passage or a tunnel under the railway station, where we also we worked with gender equality, integrating it into the built environment, and also into a part or a built environment as a tunnel where people might feel unsafe, but also places where the inhabitants of Umeå, maybe they don't really choose to be there, but they need to be there to get from one part of the city to another. We can take the next slide. And this is what it looks like in the sort of the center of this tunnel. So what we did was we worked with an understanding of feelings of safety and security, and we tried to make the tunnel very broad. We tried to make the lighting seem as much as daylight as possible. We worked a lot with exits and being able to see, so that you can feel like you can see when you walk down in one part of the tunnel, you're going to see to the other end. And also there's you can see that in the photograph, a part of a very long artwork, which is a Swedish author, a very famous Swedish author from the region where Umeå is. And there are quotes from her books all over the tunnel, which is also, we know that meeting and having women in public space, usually, not always, but makes other women also feel safe. So having this woman in the city passage, even though she's not an actual person, but through her quotes, and you can also hear her talk, we think that also increases the feeling of safety and security. Next slide. I needed to integrate this into my presentation because this is we can take the next slide. This is a piece of art in the very center of Umeå at the town square, which was sort of inaugurated 2 weeks ago. And it's, as far as we know, it's the first piece of art where a public organization like a city has initiated an artwork that is dedicated to the Me Too movement. So it's called Listen, and it's a way of saying to the inhabitants of Umeå and everyone that you need to listen to women's stories. So I just needed to integrate it into my presentation because I think it's very, very cool. Next slide. So the tour or the method that we try to do is what we call the gendered landscape, and that's very much about this holistical way of looking at gender equality, looking at the city as somewhere where gendered power structures and traditional gender norms are always present, and that we need to understand that also when we try to change and challenge that. Next slide. We have a website which is called Gendered Landscape, where you can also look at some of the clips and we've made some films of different parts of this tour that you can check out if you're interested. Next slide. And Umeå is now leading a action planning network within the URBACT program connected to the gendered landscape. So together with 6 other cities, we're looking at working with gender equality in European cities using this understanding of the gendered landscape, or as we also say, to have gender equality is something globally understood but locally contextualized, that you need to understand what gender equality means in your own city or in your own municipality or the place where you are. Next slide. This is my last slide. So I just also wanted to highlight that Umeå was the runner-up to the Innovation Capital in 2018. And what Umeå highlighted very much was the work with gender equality, but also the dialogue with citizens of Umeå, but especially also then the tradition and history of working with gender equality and what that means for the development of the city as a whole.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda, for this presentation and for showing us so many different dimensions of Umeå. I have to say I was there for the first time in May this year, and I had the chance to visit both this playground and the tunnel that Linda was showing. And I can also tell you that if you want to convince your decision makers to start acting on gender equality, take them on a field visit to Umeå, because for people who have seen this kind of stuff for the first time, they were so impressed, and the conversations really continued long after this. So I can really recommend that. And in terms of question, we have a very practical question here coming from Talia. So Linda, you talked about these differences regarding how men and women use different mobility options, and Talia would like to know, how do you then actually get men to take the bus?
I think that this is the 10,000 question. Well, we have a lot of different, what we try to do is we try to have a lot of, we have like mobility management projects where we try to aim certain activities towards men groups. We have some initiatives where we have worked specifically with workplaces that are where a large number of the employees are men, to try to encourage them to take their bikes instead of taking their car to work. So that's one example. But then we could also see from our projects, the different projects, that it's easier to, in a very general way, of course, and but we could see that it was easier to get men to go from car to bike than from car to bus, which we think is really interesting as well. So but aiming specific projects towards maybe certain employees, I think, might be a good way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So this is something that we're still looking for solutions for. So if any one of you has a good idea, please make sure to share it with Umeå. And another question that I got from a fellow Swedish inhabitant, Caroline, was she was mentioning a movement of urban girls movement. It was a project when girls' perspectives took lead in redesigning public spaces together with municipalities and professionals. And Caroline was just saying that she found it a bit frustrating that the public narrative of spaces for girls was always about safety, as if the only thing that awaits young women in a city is danger. What do you think? Is this the perspective that you also recognize, or are there also other aspects that we should look at apart from safety?
Yes, I think that one of the things that we learned from the project that we had was, and that was also why we tried to not talk about safety so much, but talk about having the right to be in a public space. And I think that is true for all young people, that young people in general are a group that usually get asked to leave different places, that they can't be there, or that public spaces like playgrounds are made for younger children. So just having this discussion on how can we make sure that we talked about what would the city look like if it was a girl's room, like having a different approach to it, talking about what would that mean in Umeå, and talking about creating spaces where they feel like they can just have the right to be there, and not having initial discussions about safety and security.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And one last question is that I think we were all quite impressed when we heard that UMEA has a gender equality officer for so many years already. I know that you have not been the person like doing it from the very beginning, but you have been working on this topic for many years. And Sylvia was wondering, from your perspective, how is this issue evolving and what changes over time? What do you think became maybe easier or more difficult in working on this topic from the municipality perspective?
It's a difficult question,
Yes.
I think. But I feel like it has gone to a more there is a bigger understanding of how gender equality is part of sustainable development and how it's part of developing a city and making it an attractive place to live, instead of looking at it as something where you need to check, like tick the boxes. Okay, have we worked with gender equality? But instead, you try to see there is a much larger understanding now, I think, and a willingness, like people are willing to work with creating like gender equal spaces or gender connected to infrastructure or like combating climate change, that you see that it's a crucial issue within that instead of like adding it at the end of projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning this, and I do recognize it's also basically a question that we could dedicate another seminar to. There are many other questions, very valid, that I will try to come back, but just one for the end, because apparently people's imagination was very captured by this example with sustainable mobility, and I have to admit it's not the first time that I heard it, and I still find it very impressive. So one person has a suggestion that actually the best way of getting people out of cars is just to close city centers for cars. And that's true. I think it's happening in many cities, and also to a certain extent is happening in UMEA. And then someone was curious how much you were able to actually what were the consequences of having all this data? Did you actually decide then to go for electric buses, or are you trying to focus on behavior change, or are you trying to do both? Was a question from Dimitra.
I think we're trying to do both.
Uh-huh.
But I would say that, but that's also because I work with gender equality. I would say that electrifying a bus fleet is a lot easier than getting men to take the bus. So I think that maybe think about how you distribute the resources. That behavioral change is very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really interesting point. We got some also comment here from Patricia that she's missing more southern experiences, for example, from Catalonia. And I think it's a very valid point. There are many interesting examples. Some of them we know, some maybe not. Towards the end of this webinar, we will also tell you how to stay in touch with us. Sally was already mentioning this LinkedIn group. And if there are examples that you know of, please feel free to share them. I also wanted to say, I already mentioned in the beginning that we wanted to have also voices from Rosario and from Buenos Aires, and this didn't work out for different reasons. But yes, we recognize that there are many more interesting examples as well. And I think with this, we are moving to a more general discussion part. So I will invite all the panelists again. So Sally, Michelle and Nina from Fredericton, and Linda from UMEA. If you have any questions or points, please put them either in the Q&A or send to me through the chat. But as a start, I would like to come back to the question that Patricia asked earlier during the webinar. It was a question addressed to Sally, and that's also one of the questions that could basically turn into a separate webinar. It was, Sally, what are your hopes or expectations regarding gender actions becoming a really transversal element of politics? Would you like to take this?
Yeah. Yes, I will. Thanks for that question, Patricia, and for your second comment as well. Maybe it was one of the points that got missed a bit in the technical blips at the beginning, but one of the points in the Gender Equal Cities report from URBACT is that gender equality is a transversal, a cross-cutting issue, and that there's a danger with cross-cutting issues that they become tick boxes, that they become sort of neglected, or sometimes just too difficult because gender's all over the place. So how do you cope with that? For example, in the urban agenda of the European Union, gender equality is a cross-cutting issue, but we struggle to see where in a few places it has been addressed explicitly, but not in most of the partnerships around that. And I think we've heard in the presentations today some of the solutions to that, which is how to have a coordinated or integrated approach to gender, like Linda has talked about. We've seen it in some other cities where there's sort of an approach where there's a central unit, but there's a reach into all of the different departments. There are gender champions in departments, so that's always on the agenda, having a gender perspective. And I guess the second thing is to have a culture change and have training, which we heard from Fredericton, that the awareness of gender has been raised by talking about it, by training people. So I think these are the ways that we make a transversal issue out of gender equality. I mean, it's a lot of work, and we have to keep going with it and find the right structure in each city, and keep talking to NGOs and academics who all bring information, knowledge, and help us to fill the gaps on that.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just quickly come back on the issue that Caroline mentioned as well about the media perception on safety?
Mm-hmm.
I think what we also talked about in the report is that basically good city design is good for gender and sort of universal design. And if you think about older people and pedestrianization and crossings, all of these things are part of a gender-sensitive city. So framing the conversation in different ways is helpful sometimes, and I think Vienna are quite good at that, the way that they have talked about just livability of the city and gender being a part of that. And I also think Patricia's point about southern examples is important. We have some in our report that we didn't actually put into the webinar, but you might have seen the recent BBC film on Barcelona, how a women-led city or how a women-designed city would be, and it had Punta 6 were in that. And things like how the super blocks and pedestrianization are part of a gender equal city, but they benefit everybody in their sustainable development. So thanks for all the questions there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you also for all the questions coming in right now. I hope we can at least briefly address all of them. I think Umea has also raised your talk. Linda has raised a lot of curiosity, but I think some of these questions also apply to Fredericton. So one question that I think is really interesting also in the context of what Sally said of raising awareness within the city, it's also an interesting question about citizens. So Sonia was asking whether citizens value the gender approach of the city and are they aware? And maybe first I would ask briefly Fredericton if this is even the case or if it was more like of an internal exercise. And then we can move to Umea. So Michelle, Nina, do you want to say something about how your citizens are seeing this, or is that not an issue yet?
I wouldn't say it's not an issue, but we approach this from the philosophy that we need to look inwards to make sure that we're dealing with it internally before we turn the scope outwards. So our project perspective was more from an inward, same as Parma, Italy, looking at within our own municipality to make sure that our people are talking the language and speaking, just speaking the language that we want them to speak.
I think too there will be an opportunity once we've established, gotten our feet under us, if you will, because I think we're talking about gender and I think it was acknowledged earlier that we said this can be something that's difficult to talk about, and it's one of those things that if not approached from perhaps I don't want to use the word right, but it's the only one that's coming to mind right now, from the right direction, it becomes polarizing, and we can actually divide genders as opposed to bringing them together. So to answer the question, no, our citizens are not aware of it. Certainly not. It hasn't been a movement to make them aware of it. But I think there will be a time for that, and it's not yet. So it's an awesome question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda. How is it in Umea?
I think that there is quite a lot of knowledge about gender equality, but Umeå is also a city that has where there's been a lot of like active women's movement. So it's not, of course, not just the work of like the municipality or public organizations. So I think that there is a knowledge, and also a lot of the inhabitants I know are very appreciative of the work that is being done. But then I would also like to say that there are a lot of processes that start maybe within the city administration, and the discussions get started from a gender equality and understanding of gendered power structures. But the actual things that the inhabitants can see is maybe that we change the way we do citizen dialogue when it comes to urban planning, but it's not so outspoken that that is a gender equality project, but that the sort of the changes within the administration starts from a discussion on gender equality and ends up being a different way of having dialogue, but you don't present it as now we're doing work with gender equality. You can just see that there's a change in the way we do dialogue. So I think that there is an understanding, but there's also, it's not always so visible that the changes in the processes come from working with gender equality.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. If you need to like label them as gender equality activities for people to appreciate them or not. Also linking to another comment here from Patricia about right-wing parties coming to power in many countries, in some cities, many of them with clear anti-gender discourse. And I have to say, being originally Polish, it's something I feel very strongly about. And the problem is that sometimes it's okay to do the things we would have labeled as gender equality related, but it makes it way more risky if you call them like this. I don't know if it's also the case in your countries. And there's one more question to Umeå that I think is also very interesting from Ines. Thank you for this question. So you have been talking, Linda, about all these activities that you have and quite a history, but how far is gender actually mainstreamed in your urban planning practices? Can you give some examples of how this has been included?
Yes. Well, the change in one part of the urban planning is dialogue, and I would say that has changed a lot over the last 5 years. So that's a very an effect of working with gender equality. Then I'm part of every sort of strategy document connected to urban planning. And also since that a lot of the sort of decisions when it comes to urban planning on an overall or connected to the master planning, that's decisions by the city council. So that means that the gender equality committee is always involved in those processes. But then it's also it is mainstream. There are the different departments have action plans on how they integrate gender equality into their part of the urban planning. But then there's also national legislation that we need to take into consideration. So I wouldn't say that we feel like we are done or that everything is perfect, but I would say that it has been mainstreaming to a certain extent anyway.
Mm-hmm. And there is also another question to Umeå. Now you will be happy to hear no longer about the buses, even though the bus thing was obviously very inspiring. But also I think it's really fascinating how, it's so that data is really triggering our imagination, no? Because this other slide that you have shown with regarding people consumption behaviors, and there's a question here if you have somehow used this data and these gender differences that you have identified regarding, for instance, the grocery shopping, or was this more for increasing your overall understanding?
That survey is quite new, so there hasn't been a lot of work being done with that as a base yet. But just shortly mention one of the other findings from the survey was that when we look at the survey, we can see that women in Umeå shop second hand more than men in all categories except technology. like computers and phones. So then we can also see like this very like a gendered aspect of that. So we've started this discussion on how do we create both how do we make men buy more used goods or second-hand goods, but also how do we make sure that young women and older women are confident in purchasing like technique that is already been used or is second-hand. So, but we will use it.
Thank you. Thank you. That's also an interesting observation regarding the second-hand shopping. We're also getting a comment here from Burkhardt that in Germany sometimes other labels are used to make the discourse less political. So to avoid the sometimes contagious word gender, you can talk about safer cities, family-friendly cities, barrier-free cities, inclusive, and so on. I think it's a question for another debate, perhaps, how much we should hide more political terms and how much we should really put them on our banners and stop them being so contagious. That's perhaps not always possible, but that's definitely an interesting debate. But as much as I feel, are all warming up and more questions are coming from your side, and we still have so many of you online with us, the webinar is coming to an end. I would like to thank all the panelists and thank all of you that stayed with us for your patience regarding some technical hiccups. I hope that despite that you were able to learn something new and you felt also motivated to see what's going on in your city and how you can support this going further and what kind of new ideas you can bring in. And maybe as a little goodbye part, I would like to quickly hand over to Sally because URBACT is running this Gender Equal Cities initiative that I am also part of. And I think it's really important that these are not just one-off discussions, but that we can continue building a community and that we don't always have to start from scratch, but build on what is already there. So Sally will tell you more about how you can be part of this community. Over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Anya. Yes, it's been really interesting, and I love watching the questions coming in on the chat as well. There's always so many things to think about, and when we talk about gender equality, it goes into so many different sectors and dimensions. There's lots of work to do, but lots of good inspiration. In terms of URBACT's ongoing work on gender equal cities, we've launched our report that you'll be able to find on the link on International Women's Day this year. On International Women's Day next year, we will do a follow-up on that to try and add more cases and examples in terms of what we found out in the last year. So please come forward and tell us what you're doing and any cases you know about. We have the new network, which is led by Umia, Linda and her colleagues leading. So we're really excited to see how the 7 cities in that network will develop their own work on gender with an action plan. And we're hoping also next year that one of the meetings of that network will be opened up to other cities, to non-URBACT cities, to do a kind of 2 or 3 day exchange and training around different elements of gender equality. So the way to keep up to date with information about that is to follow URBACT on social media and to join our LinkedIn group on the Gender Equal Cities group. We'll make sure that we promote those opportunities there. And Anya and I are also thinking about developing some training for gender equality champions, possibly for elected representatives at local level, for people to have an understanding about how to work on gender in the city level. And so keep your eyes posted for that, and we'd welcome any inputs from you as well. So this is not at the end where we're getting going on gender equality. We need to go faster and better, and the way we do that is together, definitely. So thanks a lot for joining, and thanks. Back over to you, Anya.
Yeah, so just a final thank you from my side. I would like to thank Shreya from the IUC Secretariat that did all behind the scenes work and actually made it possible for us to have this conversation. So thank you very much, Shreya, and everyone else who helped out with that. I would like to really thank our panelists, you, Sally, but also our guests from Fredericton and from Umea. I think it's really great to be able to make this sometimes pretty vague gender equality or gender equity stories very concrete and show what exactly is happening in cities. And I know from my own example that then it also makes it much easier to explain to others why this is important. So please take these examples and use them, and hopefully add your own examples soon. And thank you very much for all your questions and participation. The video recording of this webinar will be available at the knowledge sharing platform, first only for IUC cities, but then within 3 weeks for all of you. And if you have any questions, if you want to share more cases, please join the LinkedIn group or contact us directly, and we will be happy to continue this conversation. And there will be another webinar as part of the IUC series. This is not ending. It will be on financing on the 23rd of January. And please check the IUC website for more news on that. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, and have a good afternoon. And I hope we can all feel responsible for making gender equal cities happen. And I hope we can all support each other in making that happen. Thank you very much from my side. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.